All right, in class we talked about chapter 42, and that was the blood system. The main idea here was that it's continuously kind of moving substances around the body, taking nutrients and oxygen to the cells, taking the carbon dioxide and waste away from the cells, and getting it back to the organ systems that we'll eventually talk about and how it's gotten rid of. Okay, so one of the TOK questions I want you guys to consider is our current understanding is that emotions are the product of activity in the brain rather than the heart. Is knowledge based on science more valid than knowledge based on intuition? So take a few seconds, write down a response to that, and then we'll discuss it in class. Okay? So as far as vertebrate circulation is concerned, we talked about vertebrates generally having one or two atria and two ventricles, and we talk about it being a closed system. In other words, the blood is kind of contained within the circulatory system. It doesn't mix in with any interstitial fluid or anything like insects have. Okay. We have the cardiovascular system, as it's sometimes referred to as, so that's the heart and the lungs. And the heart itself has the two atria, which are on the top, and then the ventricles, which are on the bottom. The atria receive the blood either from the body or from the lungs, the vascular or the pulmonary system, or the ventricles, they receive blood that's going to either get pumped to the lungs, okay, or it's going to get pumped throughout the body. And we kind of went over those types of things in class and talked about them, and I'll kind of address those here in a few minutes, okay? So the first thing is we have arteries, and these carry a blood away from the heart. And generally speaking, it's oxygenated blood, we said. With the case of the pulmonary arteries, however, it's carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs. So that's the only case where it's deoxygenated. But the one thing that's always true, we said, is that arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins, on the other hand, are carrying blood back to the heart. And more often than not, it's deoxygenated blood. And the only exception is the pulmonary veins, which are carrying blood from the lungs that has been oxygenated back to the heart. But again, just carrying the blood to the heart is how we're going to classify the veins. And then the capillaries, these are the tiny tubules that are taking blood that's rich in nutrients and rich in oxygen and into the tissues that need them, exchanging them for the gas and the nutrients, and then taking it to the venule and returning it back to the body, the various systems for processing and so forth. Okay, so the arteries, veins, and capillaries, those are the things that we've talked about in class. And the other thing that we talked about is the arteries are generally much thicker. They're going to carry the blood under high pressure. They've got thicker walls, they've got more smooth muscle in them, and the veins, on the other hand, are much thinner. They don't have as much smooth muscle, and they've got some valves to kind of prevent the backflow. So those are some of the other things that we went over in class. Okay, so as far as the capillaries are concerned, we looked at this sort of a figure when we were in class and talked about it. And one of the things that we discussed here with these things is this, generally speaking, right through here. This is the spot where that nutrient and gas exchange occurs. Okay, so you've got the arteriole right here. This is bringing the nutrient-rich blood in. You've got the venule right here. That's taking the waste rich blood or the nutrient poor blood, oxygen poor blood back. And then the very, very thin walls of these capillaries here, this is the site where you get the gas exchange occurring and the nutrient exchange and those sorts of things. And we looked at this figure right here where you can see that during this area, or in the area right here that I've circled, this is where you have a huge cross-sectional area kind of increasing. So we're increasing the area, and what that's doing is that's slowing down the flow. So it's moving very quickly through the arteries or the arterioles. It's moving more slowly, but still quicker than in the capillary beds. So we move fast, we slow down due to this huge cross-sectional area, and the reason why is because we got to allow time for the nutrient and waste exchange to occur. And then once it gets through these capillary beds, you can see that the cross-sectional area decreases again, and then the pressure goes up, but it's not as high, recall, because the arteries have the smooth muscle, which is kind of acting to hold that pressure high. And you can see here we've got the pressure when you're looking at it. So the pressure is high in the arterial end, it's low on the venous end, and then you can see what's happening to the velocity. So we discussed those types of things. Okay. So back to this, you say the arteriole is going to bring in the blood to the capillary bed, and the venule is going to drain it from the capillary bed back into the venous flow. And then here are the figures that I just showed you that we talked about more exclusively in class. One of the things that we can say here is that the the different circulation systems that are involved. We have a separate one for the lungs that's typically referred to as the pulmonary system, and then we have the cardiovascular system, the heart system, and the blood travels through the heart twice. One says deoxygenated blood, and then one says oxygenated blood. In this double circulation, this is where we're going to bring the blood from the body back in, pump it to the lungs for gas exchange, and then pump it back into, or circulate it back into the heart, and then pump it throughout the body. So the first time it kind of comes in, it's rich in CO2, low in oxygen, and then the second time it comes in, it's low in CO2 and high in oxygen content. Okay. And this is this whole idea of double circulation, we said, is providing for this vigorous blood flow. A lot of oxygenation can supply and meet the demands of the metabolism of the body. And it's just some organisms that typically have this are reptiles, mammals, and birds. Okay, they typically have this double circulation. And what happens in double circulation, of course, is, if you recall what we talked about earlier, is that on the venous side we have low pressure, less smooth muscles, more valves to prevent the backflow. It's still getting forced around when the heart beats, but it's not being assisted by the smooth muscle that you find in the arteries. And the arteries are able to kind of maintain that high pressure because of the thick amount of smooth muscle that they have. So that when the blood returns back to the heart, the pressure gets restored, and it can pass through this circuit throughout the body. Okay, so now we talked about the muscle. Okay, and the heart and the muscle and the various kind of chambers in there, and we discussed one of the things here that we looked at with the heart was, get to it here, is we looked at when the blood comes back into, let's see if I can maybe change the color a little bit here. Okay, so when the blood comes back into, and that's kind of hard to see. I'll just stick with the black. I was hoping that there was a yellow in there, but we talked about the blood kind of coming in through the inferior vena cava, okay, and then it enters this right atrium here, and then it's also coming in from the superior vena cava, okay, so the inferior vena cava is returning blood from the bottom portion of the body, the superior vena cava from the upper portion of the body, and they go into the right atrium. And once they get into the right atrium, when the atria contract, the right atrium forces it down into the right ventricle, okay. The blood coming back from the lungs is returned to the left atrium, and when the atria contract, now the blood is being forced into the left ventricle, all right? And now when the ventricles contract, the right ventricle is going to force this blood, the deoxygenated blood, up into and through the pulmonary veins and back to the lungs. And then when the left ventricle contracts, this is going to force blood up into the aorta, okay, and then to the body, more or less. And we talked about as well the reason this wall right here of the heart, especially this left ventricle, the reason it's so thick is because it's got to pump the blood throughout the entire body. So those are some of the things that we discussed when we were talking about the heart. Okay, so as far as the four-chambered heart is concerned, it's got a lot of muscle in it, we said, and there's a rhythmic set of contractions that are occurring, and it's starting with the SA node and then going through the AV node and so forth, and we'll get to more of that here in a second. But what we've got is the heart beats kind of bump in two, kind of in unison, but not all at the same time. So the atria contract, then the ventricles, and the atria, then the ventricles, and that's so that it can keep the blood moving throughout the heart. And there's a series of valves that we were discussing that slam shut when, for instance, when the right ventricle and the left ventricle, when those are contracting, we don't want the blood flowing back into the atria where it came from. So those valves slam shut and prevent that backflow and ensure that only the blood is going either throughout the body or into the lungs. And then when the atria contract, those valves open and the ventricles are relaxed and they allow this blood to pass in. So, and then moving the body throughout, moving the blood throughout the body. Okay, so the ventricles, we said that these are typically larger because they're going to be involved in moving more blood or blood more forcefully throughout the body, for instance, in the case of the left ventricle. And then you've got these valves. We talked about the atrioventricular valve. We talked about the semilunar valve, tricuspid valve, the mitral valve, and how they've got different names and so forth in prevention of the backflow of blood. Okay. So as far as maintaining the heart rhythm is concerned, keeping the oxygen levels throughout the tissues is very important, making sure that the heart is beating properly so that it's moving the blood around the body correctly. So you've got the pacemaker in the heart, and that's the SA node. Okay, and the SA node lies in the right atrium. And what that does is that's involved in kind of, it's self-excitable. In other words, it's the heart's pacemaker. And it certainly is innervated by nerves, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But when this thing sends out its kind of electrical impulse, it's going to cause the atria to contract, and then there's a slight delay, and then the ventricles are going to contract. Okay, so these cardiac muscles, we say that they're self-excitable. They don't need a constant nerve impulse to continually contract. They're initiating the heartbeat. Okay, so the SA node, we said, that sets the rate and the timing of the heart contractions, and we said that it's located again in the walls of the right atrium. And these specialized cells, these self-excitable cells, initiate this contraction. So you have two types of hearts that we discussed. We talked about myogenic hearts. We talked about neurogenic hearts. Myogenic hearts, this is where the heart's pacemaking ability originates actually in the heart, whereas the neurogenic hearts have nerves that innervate and initiate these contractions. And the human heart is a myogenic heart. Okay, so once the SA node generates this electrical impulse, it's going to pass through the electrical activity is going to pass through the atria and cause it to contract, and then there's a slight delay as this signal is passed to the AV node. And then once it gets to the AV node, and then the nerve impulse is kind of passed down through these Purkinje fibers here that you can see. The delay ensures that the atria are going to empty before the ventricles actually contract. Okay, and you can see in this picture here the Purkinje fibers in orange. These things are going to relay this this nerve impulse down to the apex of the heart, which is the point you can see here that it's labeled. And then as this contracts, we were talking about in class that the heart kind of goes like this, when it's contracting more or less, and it's acting to kind of wring out the blood that's in there. So when it's doing that, the valves, we said, are slamming shut so that the blood doesn't flow back into the atria. And now these ventricles are emptying, and then as soon as that cycle is done, the SA node sets off another round of electrical activity that causes the atria to contract. The ventricles at this point will be relaxed, and then that's going to allow the movement of blood throughout the heart, throughout the lungs, and of course throughout the body. Okay, so we talked about the SA node and how that sets the tempo for the actual heart, but it's innervated by the two nerves that we were discussing. We have the accelerans nerve and we have the vagus nerve, and these things are part of a larger system. We said the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. So if you think of the sympathetic system as being the fight or flight type of thing, the thing that's going to kind of increase the activity of whatever it is in your body, in this case the heart. And then we talked about the parasympathetic, which is kind of the rest and digest system. That's the one that's going to kind of undo the actions of the of the sympathetic nerve. So we have the accelerans nerve, and that reminds you of accelerate. That's going to accelerate the heart rate. We'll talk about that here in just a second. And then you have the vagus nerve, which is going to act to kind of slow it down. Okay. Now the brainstem, we said, is called the medulla, and that's right at the base of the brain, above the spinal cord. And the two main divisions that it contains are the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. We said that, of course, that those are opposing one another. Okay, and the heart gets innervated by the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. The sympathetic system, this is the part of the accelerans nerve. This contains the stimulation that runs along and dumps neurotransmitter onto the SA node and speeds up the heart rate. And then you have the vagus nerve, which is the parasympathetic. It's going to undo the action of the sympathetic of the accelerans nerve, and that's going to dump neurotransmitter on and act to slow this heart rate down. Okay, so when the accelerans nerve receives the signal, for instance, you get startled. Your heart starts beating fast, and what's happening is the accelerans nerve is receiving some signal from the base of the brainstem where the basic functions, for instance, the fight or flight system, kind of originates from. That's going to dump the adrenaline or the epinephrine onto the SA node, and that's going to act to increase the strength and rate of contractions of the heartbeat. Okay. Physical activity causes this. Okay, the fight or flight response, for instance, when you're startled, that type of thing. When the blood pressure goes down, like when you are laying flat and then all of a sudden you get up and it starts pumping really fast. There's all sorts of neural connections that are stimulating the accelerans nerve to release this neurotransmitter, this epinephrine, onto the AV node. Okay, to get the entire body to kind of react as though you'd want it to. And we went over a number of these types of examples in class. So, as usual, if you've got questions or you can't remember or you're absent, make sure that you see me or a classmate or something so that we can get this kind of wrapped up, some of these examples that we gave. Okay. Now, once you've gotten rid of the need for this fight or flight, or you're done exercising, or your body's adjusted to kind of having, stood up, what happens is the vagus nerve is going to kind of undo the actions of the accelerans nerve. So the vagus nerve is going to release the acetylcholine onto the SA node, and then in doing so, what that's going to do is, excuse me, I said SA node. On the AV node, it's also going to release it on the AV node, but the SA node and the AV node are going to receive the acetylcholine from the vagus nerve, and then this is going to act to lower the heart rate. Okay, so you've got the AV, the pacemaker, that's going to release the acetylcholine onto that and act to slow this down, get you into that kind of rest and digest state. Okay, lower your blood pressure, lower your heart rate, those types of things. So here you can look. You can see this is where the vagus nerve and the accelerans nerve, but really in this particular picture, the vagus nerve is going to innervate the SA node as well as the AV node to kind of act to calm the entire heart down. So you can go ahead and kind of take a look at this picture here. You don't need to worry about all of the minor details in terms of the ganglia and things like that. Just look at where the nerve is running from, of course, the base of the brain, and where it's kind of innervating or ending at. In this case, the SA node, that's SAN, and then the AVN is the AV node. Okay? All right, so what I want you to do now is just to listen to, this is a video that I found, listen to what's going on here. You don't need to worry about all of the minutia. Just pay attention to the main types of things that we just talked about here, as well as the stuff we discussed in class.
In this video, we'll discuss how heart rate is controlled by nervous innervation. So if I can first draw your attention down to the aorta and the aortic arch, you'll see that we have some aortic baroreceptors located on the aortic arch.
Those are pressure sensors.
We also have baroreceptors up here on the internal carotid artery.
Right in through
These
here.
are called the carotid baroreceptors. And these carotid baroreceptors are located on a swelling on the internal carotid artery. This is called the carotid sinus. So the carotid
It's not
sinus
necessary
is
that you know that.
on the internal carotid artery, and on that swelling are located the carotid baroreceptors. So we have two kinds of baroreceptors. Baroreceptors are stretch receptors that can detect the change in pressure, the change in stretch on the arteries, and then send signals via their nerves that they're connected to up to the medulla oblongata.
The
So
brainstem.
we have the aortic baroreceptors, which are sending information about blood pressure up the vagus nerve to the medulla oblongata. And then we have stretch receptors or baroreceptors on the carotid sinus of the internal carotid artery, sending information about blood pressure up via the glossopharyngeal nerve.
Which is not important that you know. It's just a nerve that's transmitting information.
So we have information coming from two sources, from the aortic baroreceptors and the carotid baroreceptors. Now this information about blood pressure, whether it's high or low, is integrated in the cardiac control center within the medulla oblongata. And then a decision is made by the cardiac control center. Is the blood pressure too high? Is it too low? Above the, or around the set point. So remember, in the cardiac control center, there is a homeostatic set point of what blood pressure, a range of what blood pressure should be in. If it goes too high or too low, the cardiac control center has to then send an efferent signal or a correction signal down to the heart to increase or decrease the blood pressure and bring it back under homeostatic control. So, if the blood pressure is too high, a efferent signal can be sent down, back down the vagus nerve. Here you can see the arrow. If the blood pressure is too high, an efferent signal can be sent down the vagus nerve via parasympathetic fibers and innervate the SA node. And what this will do is it will release acetylcholine, and acetylcholine will have an inhibitory effect on the SA node and slow the heart rate down. Okay, so if blood pressure is too high, a correction signal can be sent down the vagus nerve via parasympathetic fibers, which release acetylcholine on the SA node and slow the heart rate down. On the opposite end, if the blood pressure is too low and we need to increase the blood pressure to get back into that homeostatic range, a correction signal is sent via sympathetic fibers down the cardiac nerve.
Or the accelerans nerve.
Cardiac nerve here, there are 3 cardiac nerves which come out of the cervical ganglia, and the cardiac nerve then releases norepinephrine at the SA node and increases the heart rate. So we have, okay, just to summarize, we have 2 inputs, the aortic baroreceptors and the carotid baroreceptors, sending afferent information about blood pressure up to the medulla oblongata and into the cardiac control center. And then depending on whether the blood pressure is too high or too low, a correction signal can be sent down either via the vagus nerve and parasympathetic fibers to inhibit and decrease the heart rate, or via sympathetic fibers via the cardiac nerve
or the accelerans nerve,
norepinephrine, and stimulate the heart rate.
Okay, so you can consider the cardiac nerve that he's discussing there. The accelerans nerve does the same thing. Okay, and then just the last type of thing, we were just talking a little bit about hormones, body temperature, physical activities. These things all have an effect on the heart rate, and that's either the sympathetic or the parasympathetic system that's kind of governing that. Okay, and much like the video that we just talked about. All right, so that wraps up everything. If you have any questions, as always, make sure that you write those down and we'll address them in class. Okay, we'll see you soon.